come to Genesis chapter 3 and you find the problem, don't you? Every story has a problem. Every story has a conflict. And in Genesis 3, we find the story, we find the problem, the conflict entering into this story. Paul tells us in Romans chapter 5 and verse number 12 that this is the moment in Genesis 3 where sin and death enter into the world. This is the moment when God's perfect, good, beautiful creation becomes broken by sin. We oftentimes call this story the fall of man, the fall of man from God. As we think about this really important, this really significant moment in God's story, I think there are three big ideas that we need to look at. First, this story tells us something about our enemy. When we look at Genesis chapter 3, what do we learn about sin? What do we learn about our enemy? Well, let me give you just a couple of ideas. First, we learn that our enemy wants us to doubt God. Satan wants you, Satan wants me to doubt God's character, to doubt who He is, to doubt what He's done for us, and to doubt what He has said, what He's commanded us to do in His Word. You begin reading in this story in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 1, and you read about a serpent. This serpent is the instrument that God is going to use to tempt Eve to break God's command, to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we read that this serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field. That word crafty means that the serpent was shrewd. We might say that he's a master manipulator, and he takes that master manipulation in order to tempt Eve, in order to try to draw Eve away from God, in order to cause Eve to doubt her Creator. Notice the question that the serpent asked. Did God actually say, "You shall not eat of any tree in the garden"? Did God say that? Did God look at Adam, who then looked at Eve, and say, "Hey, you're not allowed to eat of any tree that's found in the garden"? Well, now you go back to what God originally told them in Genesis 2, especially verse 16. God says, you may freely eat of every tree of the garden. Can you see what Satan is trying to do? Can you see what the serpent is trying to accomplish? Satan wants Eve to doubt God, to doubt God's character, to doubt God's generosity. Hey, did God actually tell you that you can't eat out of any of these trees? You're telling me that God put you in this beautiful garden surrounded by these beautiful trees that have beautiful fruit, and you're not allowed to eat any of it? Well, that doesn't sound like a God who's gracious. That doesn't sound like a God who's loving. That sounds like a God who wants you to starve. Satan is wanting to create doubt about who God is, about God's generosity in Eve's heart. And so we see how Eve responds in Genesis chapter 3, verses 2 and 3. When you compare what Eve says that God commanded with what God actually commanded back in chapter 2, you're going to find that she relays a lot of the information accurately. Eve gets the big ideas right when it comes to what God commanded Adam, and then how Adam would have passed that on to his wife, Eve. But when you look at the small details, I think you find what really matters. When you look at the small details of what Eve says, I think you're able to see what's actually going on in her heart. First, when you look at Genesis chapter 3, verses 2 and 3, Eve tells us that she's had her eye on this tree. She doesn't call the tree by its title like God does in Genesis chapter 2, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Instead, she talks about the tree that's where? That's in the midst of the garden. The tree that's in the middle of everything else. That tells us that Eve has not only noticed that tree, but she's had her eye on that tree. The tree that's in the midst of everything.
Is that a little low? Yeah, that's a little bit better, isn't it? I might have to hold it down here just a little bit. I'm not going to go back to the beginning, by the way, and cover everything else. The second thing that you need to notice about what Eve says, when you look at the details of what she says in Genesis 3, comparing it with Genesis chapter 2. Okay, I might just lay this down. Is Eve
actually makes God look more strict than he actually is. Notice that God said in Genesis 2 and verse number 17 that they shouldn't eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's the only restriction that God places upon them. But if you look at Genesis 3, verses 2 and 3, Eve says, you shall not, this is her relaying what God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that's in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it. Can you see how Eve is making God to be more strict than he actually is? God said, just don't eat from it. But when Eve relays what God said, she said, God commanded that we shouldn't even touch it. Then the third thing that Eve does is she drops God's emphatic tone. Notice how God is very emphatic in verse number 16. You may surely, you may freely eat of every tree of the garden. But then you look at what Eve says in chapter 3 and verse 2. We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. Not only does she drop the emphasis surely, but she also drops the word every. Then God, in verse 17, says, when you do eat of this tree, and the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. Notice the emphasis. You look at the end of verse 3, Eve takes away that emphasis by just saying, lest you die. Eve drops the sureness. Eve gets rid of God's emphatic tone. And by doing that, she's lessening not only God's generosity, but God's severity. She's lessening the consequence of sin. We see Satan trying to create doubt in Eve's heart about who God is and what God has said. And the way that she talks to the serpent, we already see little seeds of doubt in her heart. And Satan's going to work with that. Satan's going to play on that. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse number 4, we said that Eve dropped God's emphatic tone. Satan picks it back up. But he adds one word to what God said that completely changes the meaning. You shall not surely die. Eve, when you eat of that tree, you're not going to die. That's not going to happen. And let me tell you why. The only reason that God told you not to eat from that tree, notice he gets more specific as he goes. God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open. How will our eyes be open? You'll be like God. How will we be like God? Knowing good and evil. Once again, you see Satan trying to create doubt in Eve's heart about who God is and what God has said. Not only standing in direct contradiction to what God has said, but hey, the only reason that God doesn't want you to eat of this tree is because he's selfish. It's because he's higher than you are. And he just wants to hold you back from being everything that you could possibly be. He just wants to hold you back from his potential. He knows when you eat of the tree, you'll become like him. And he doesn't want you to become like him because he is so very selfish. What does our enemy want us to do? Our enemy wants us to doubt God. That's how he works his way into our hearts and lives. Our enemy wants us to doubt God's character. Satan wants you to doubt that God loves you. He wants you to doubt God's kindness. He wants you to doubt God's holiness. Satan wants you to doubt that God is with you and that God provides for you. He wants you to doubt God's severity. He wants you to doubt the consequences of sin. Satan wants you to doubt what God has said in this book. Can you hear Satan whisper in your ear from time to time? Did God actually say that? Do you think that God really means that? I mean, is that what he actually told you? This is important for us to know because Satan is not going to start where it's obvious. Satan is not going to start by attacking the big ideas. Instead, Satan starts by attacking the small details. If Satan can get us to doubt even the small details of who God is, what God has done, and what God has said, then it won't be long until we experience the fall, just like Adam and Eve did. The second thing that we need to notice about our enemy is that he's a liar. You go to Genesis 2 and verse number 17. What did God say? When you eat of the tree, you shall surely die. What did Satan say? You shall not surely die. If God is speaking truth, then what is Satan speaking? He's speaking lies. He's standing in direct contradiction to God. Then you go to Genesis 3 and verse 5. Remember how he said the only reason God doesn't want you to eat from the tree is because he knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, you'll become like him, you'll know good from evil. Is that true? I think it's partially true. Because when you go to Genesis 3 and verse 7, when they ate the fruit, what happened? Their eyes were open. You go to Genesis 3 and verse 22, God, as he removes Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, says the man has become like one of us. How? In knowing good and evil. And so what Satan says in Genesis 3 and verse 5, I believe that it's partially true, but it's also completely false. It's a half-truth, but it's an entire lie. We know that our God is omniscient. Our God is all-knowing. Our God knows good because he is good, and he can know evil completely without becoming evil himself. That's not possible for Adam and Eve. If Adam and Eve eat of the tree, they're not going to become omniscient. They're not going to become all-knowing. If Adam and Eve eat of the tree, the only way that they can know evil is by personal experience. God can stand outside of evil and know everything about it without becoming evil himself. That's not possible for Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve cannot know evil unless they become evil. And so what Satan says in Genesis 3 and verse 5, it might have some truth to it. It's also completely false. It's a bold-faced lie. That's what our enemy is. That's what he does. He's a liar. Jesus says in John 8 and verse 44 that he doesn't stand in the truth because there's no truth in it. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he's a liar and the father of lies. You think that we can learn from that? Don't listen to our enemy. Don't listen to the crafty serpent. Don't give your attention to the one who only wants to lie to you and manipulate you. Sometimes what Satan says sounds really good. And he makes some really big promises. He puts it out in front of our eyes, and it's really appetizing to us. Don't listen to Satan. Don't give in to Satan, because he's always going to lie to you. Instead, place your trust, place your faith in the God who cannot lie, the God who is truth and always communicates truth. We said that Genesis 3 is the moment when sin enters into the world. So what do we learn about sin from Genesis, the 3rd chapter? Well, again, let me give you a couple of ideas. Let's first talk about what sin is. Sin attempts to dethrone God. Sin attempts to dethrone God. You go to Genesis 3 and verse 6, as Satan is attempting to deceive Eve, she sees in verse 6 that the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, that the tree was desired to make one wise. So she took some of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her husband who was with her. Have you ever noticed that detail? Maybe sometimes when we picture this story, we picture Eve alone talking with the serpent, and Adam is off somewhere else. He's not off somewhere else. He's standing right there with her, watching and listening the entire time as his wife is being deceived by the serpent. She eats of the fruit. She gives some to her husband, and he ate as well. When we read Genesis 3 and verse 6, I don't think that we should just picture Adam and Eve breaking God's command, doing something that God told them not to do. Now, Adam and Eve are breaking God's command. They are doing something that God told them not to do. But it's so much deeper than that. There's so much more to it than that. Who is the one who, in Genesis, who gets to decide what is good? Who is the one in Genesis who has the authority to declare what's good? Genesis 1 and verse number 31, we read that when God made everything, he saw that it was very good. Who is the one in Genesis who gets to declare and decide what's not good? Well, you look at Genesis 2 and verse 18, God says it's not good that the man should be alone. When you come to this point in the book of Genesis, God is the one reigning. God is the one who decides what's good. God is the one who decides what's evil. Well, look at what Eve does in chapter 3 and verse 6. When the woman saw that the tree was what? That the tree was good. Eve looks at something that God said was not good. Something that God said was evil. And she said what? It's good for me. It's good for food. When Adam and Eve eat of this tree, they are attempting to take a position that only God holds. They're attempting to dethrone God and to become their own gods. They're looking at God to say, I'm not going to let you decide what's good for me. I'm going to decide what's good for me. I'm not going to let you decide what's evil. I'm going to decide what's evil and live my life based on that. They're attempting to dethrone their Creator as those who were made in the image of God and to become God themselves, to redefine what good actually is. See, that's what sin is. Sin attempts to dethrone God. Now, I know 1 John 3 and verse 4 says that sin is lawlessness. Sin is breaking God's law. Sin is living outside of God's law. But if you look at Genesis 3, sin is so much more than just breaking one rule or making a simple mistake. Sin is an attempt to dethrone God. Sin is image bearers of God attempting to remove the Creator from the throne and to sit down on that throne themselves. When we sin, we are looking to redefine what is good. We're attempting to take a position that only God Himself can hold. When we sin, we're looking at God to say, I'm not going to live based on what you say is good. I'm going to live based on what I say is good. I don't care what's good and evil to you. I only care what's good and evil to me, and that's the way that I'm going to choose to live my life. Sin is not just a mistake. Sin is not just breaking a simple rule. Sin is attempting to remove God from His throne and to sit down on that throne ourselves. That's what sin is, but what does sin do? Well, Genesis 3 answers that question too. Sin destroys relationships with people, creation, and God. Let's take those individually. First, we see in Genesis 3 that sin destroys relationships with people. Think about the relationship between Adam and Eve before the fall. Genesis 2 and verse 23, can you hear the joy in Adam's voice? He looks at Eve and says, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." You find the definition of marriage, God's design for marriage in verse 24, being pronounced in this moment. The man and his wife were living together in a vulnerable way, in a way that they were hiding nothing from each other. They were naked and they were not ashamed. Look at how that changes after the fall. After they eat of the tree, the Bible says both of their eyes were open. They knew that they were naked, so that they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. They were living together back in chapter 2, naked and unashamed. But after they eat of the fruit, after they sin, they feel the need to cover themselves up. They feel the need to hide from one another. They feel the need to cover their shame from one another. They're no longer comfortable in one another. They've lost their state of innocence. You look at Genesis 3, verses 11 and 12. When God questions Adam, "Did you eat of the tree?" What does Adam say? He doesn't take ownership of it. Instead, he blames his wife. "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit and I ate of it." This is the same Adam who just a few verses ago said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." Now he's throwing her under the bus. "Oh, it's her fault that I ate of the fruit. You need to go talk to her." Genesis 3 and verse 16, one way to translate that, when God speaks to Eve, "Your desire shall be contrary to your husband." In other words, there's going to be a power struggle between you and your husband, but he will rule over you. Sin destroys the perfect relationship that Adam and Eve had. Sin also destroyed their relationship with creation. Genesis 2 and verse 15, God put Adam in the garden to work it and keep it. This was not laborious work. This was fulfilling work. In Genesis 2 verses 19 and 20, all of the animals in the Garden of Eden come to Adam and he gives them names one by one. They're living in perfect harmony with God's creation. What happens after the fall? God looks at the serpent back in chapter 3 and verse 1 who he had made and said, "Now you're going to be cursed. And there's going to be enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring." I think the most simple way to interpret that, and the way that a lot of Jewish commentators think about this, is it's a struggle between creation and man. That there's always going to be enmity between man and the serpent. Genesis 3 and verse 16 says that childbearing is going to take place, but now since sin has happened, the childbearing is going to happen in pain. And that pain is going to be multiplied for the woman. Adam's still going to work from the ground, but it's not going to be fulfilling work. Instead, the ground is cursed because of him. It's in pain that he would eat. Verse 18, "Thorns and thistles will be brought forth, and by the sweat of his face he shall eat His bread. Sin destroys their relationship with creation, but then ultimately sin destroys relationship with God, doesn't it? When Adam and Eve lived in the garden, they lived in perfect relationship with God. I think the assumption from Genesis 3 and verse 8 is that every day they would walk with God in the garden. They would have fellowship with God in the garden. Can you imagine them talking? Can you imagine them laughing with one another? Can you imagine them enjoying one another? God enjoying His creation enjoying Him. What happens after they sin? The man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord among the trees of the garden. You go to the day before that, they're walking and fellowshipping with God in the garden. Now they feel the need to hide themselves from the presence of the Lord. Instead of taking ownership for their sin, we said Adam tried to play the blame game, not just by saying it's Eve's fault, but he even looks at God to say, this is your fault. The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit of the tree and I ate. Then in verse 13, when the woman is questioned, she said, the serpent deceived me. It's Satan's fault. You need to go and talk to him. God told them when they ate of the tree, they would surely die, and that happened, didn't it? You find the process of physical death coming into the world. Genesis 3, 22 and 23. God removes them from the Garden of Eden so that they would not have access to the tree of life and live forever in their sinful and fallen state. On that day, the process of physical death began. Paul says in Romans 5 and verse 12 that sin came into the world through one man, and death, physical death and spiritual death, through sin. And so death spread to all men because all sinned. Sin is never going to build up. Sin is never going to benefit. Sin is never, regardless of how it might look or how it might feel, sin will never bring good things into our lives. Sin will always bring destruction. Sin destroys our relationships with one another, even the people who we love the most, the people who are closest to us. Sin destroys relationship with creation, but ultimately, and most importantly, sin destroys relationship with God. Instead of walking with God and fellowshipping with God because of sin, we feel the need to hide ourselves from God. Instead of taking ownership of our sin, we feel the need to blame others, to blame Satan. Satan made me do it, or maybe even to blame our sin on God Himself. Sin is an intentional rebellion against God, and all it invites into our lives is destruction. Up to this point in the study, can you see the problem in God's story? But whose story is it? It's God's story. So real quickly as we close, what does this text teach us about God? Let me give you one idea and then the lesson will be yours. God has a plan. You see sin and death entering into God's creation and completely ruining everything. You see God's beautiful, good, perfect world being absolutely broken. But don't think that was a surprise to God. Don't think that came out of left field and caught Him with His head turned. Don't think that that threw God a curveball, because in the midst of all of this destruction and death and sin and brokenness, we see that God has a plan to bring His creation back into relationship with Himself. Genesis 3 and verse 15, we read it a few minutes ago. God tells the serpent, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Now we know that's not just talking about hostility between people and snakes. Think about the serpent as Satan. There's going to be a war. There's going to be a fight. There's going to be enmity between humanity and Satan. But eventually a man's going to come, the seed of woman, the offspring of woman, who's going to bruise or crush the head of the serpent. And the serpent will only be able to bruise his heel. Does that sound like someone you know well? Take your mind to the cross of Jesus. As Jesus was hung on the cross, I think that Satan certainly bruised his heel when you think about all the suffering and the difficulty that he went through. But what did Jesus do on the cross? Jesus put an end to the enmity between man and the serpent. Jesus destroyed, Jesus crushed the head of the serpent and won the war against the enemy. Genesis 3 and verse 7. Adam and Eve eat of the tree, They knew that they were naked as their eyes were opened, and so they sewed together fig leaves and made themselves loincloths. They try to cover themselves up. They try to cover up their own shame, their own guilt, their own brokenness, but apparently that was a pitiful attempt. Because in Genesis 3 and verse 21, out of His grace, the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skin and clothed them. Where did God get those garments of skin? God takes an animal from His creation and offers a bloody sacrifice. And from that sacrifice, He takes the skin in order to clothe Adam and Eve when they could not clothe themselves. He takes the garments of skin from that sacrificed animal and puts them on Adam and Eve, and now they're going to wear that clothing of skin wherever they go, covering up their guilt, covering up their shame, covering up their nakedness. Does that sound familiar to you? Again, take your mind back to the cross of Jesus, when God offered a bloody sacrifice once and for all. Galatians 3 and verse 27 says that when we're baptized into Christ, what happens? We clothe ourselves with Jesus. You and I can't cover up our own shame and guilt. You and I cannot cover up our own nakedness. At best, it's just a pitiful attempt when we try. And so God, through the bloody sacrifice once and for all, clothes us, covers up our guilt and shame. And we wear our Lord Jesus Christ wherever we go. Can you see how God has a plan in Genesis, the 3rd chapter? Genesis 3, 22 through 24, we've said a couple of times, God, not only in punishment, but also in His grace, removes Adam and Eve from the garden. They could not continue to live in the garden and have access to the tree of life in their sinful state. In their fallen state, they could not live forever in the presence of God. So God removes them from the tree of life, and in verse 24, He puts cherubim with a flaming sword to turn away people from the way to the tree of life. People do not have access to the tree of life at the end of Genesis 3. People cannot. It's impossible for people to live forever in the presence of God at the end of Genesis, the 3rd chapter. But then you go to the very last chapter of the Bible, Revelation chapter 22, verses 1 and 2. We're given a look into the throne room of God, where from the throne of God and of the Lamb there's a river flowing. What's on either side of that river? Look at verse 2. The tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit. How can you and I, sinful human beings, regain access to the tree of life? How can you and I one day step into the throne room of God in order to live eternally in His presence? Can't do it on your own. Can't do it based off of your own good works. The only way that you and I can have access to the tree of life, which is being guarded at the end of chapter 3, is through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. You look in Genesis, the 3rd chapter, and everything goes wrong. The problem shows up in God's story. Sin enters into the world and death through sin, Romans 5 and verse 12. But God has a plan to put that problem to an end, to bring a solution to that difficulty through the death, burial, and resurrection of His Son. In a chapter that's defined by darkness and sin and death, you find a little glimmer of hope that brings us to the feet of the cross of Jesus Christ. That's God's story. What sin has broken, God fixes through Jesus. The problems that have come about as a result of the crafty serpent and the fall of man, God makes right through the death, burial, and resurrection of His Son. Realize today that you cannot cover up your own shame, guilt, and brokenness. You might try, but it'll be a pitiful attempt. You can't overcome Satan on your own. You can't crush his head on your own. Satan is stronger than you are. Satan is smarter than you are. And if you try to stand against him one-on-one, you're going to lose every single time. You can't have access to the tree of life and live forever in the presence of God by just doing better and working more. The only way that we can overcome the problem in God's story is by being connected to Him through the Son. And so the decision when we come to the end of Genesis chapter 3 is one that's simple to understand, but sometimes very difficult to make. Am I going to stand with the serpent in sin and death? Am I going to allow him to continue to lie to me? Am I going to continue to allow sin to ruin my life? Or am I going to stand with the Son of God who crushes the head of the serpent and allows me to live in the presence of God, not just here, but in the hereafter? Which choice will we make today? Which is it for you, the serpent or the Son? Think about that as together we stand and sing.